Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight we're travelling to a land between worlds, a peninsula of sunlight and stone, where faith shaped every breath and doubt lingered in the shadows. Medieval Spain was never one thing. It was a meeting of prayers, languages, and empires, all sharing the same restless soil. Here, mosques, churches, and synagogues stood within earshot, and every bell answered a call to prayer. It was a world of beauty and cruelty, reason and devotion, a fragile harmony always on the edge of breaking. Before we drift into that world, do me one small favour. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you'd prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you want the ultimate immersive experience, consider using a pair of wireless earbuds. They're comfortable, discreet, and designed so you can wear them even while sleeping. I've linked my favourite pair plus other sleep tools in the description. Now, lie back, get comfortable. Let's begin. The Iberian Peninsula stretches out like a promise and a contradiction. It is a land where sunlight strikes stone until both seem to glow, where the mountains fold into valleys that remember the scent of rain, and where every road leads to someone else's border. In the north, the Pyrenees stand as a spine of granite and pride, holding back the chill winds of France. In the centre, the great Castilian plateau rolls outward in brown and gold, its vast emptiness punctuated by the low hum of insects and the slow movement of herds. To the south lies Andalusia, a country within a country, where olive groves shimmer like green waves and the soil holds the memory of centuries of hands. The coasts, long, jagged and endlessly contested, open to the Mediterranean on one side and the Atlantic on the other, carrying the dreams of fishermen, merchants, and conquerors. It is a landscape that seems eternal, though every stone has changed ownership more times than anyone could politely count. Medieval Spain was never truly Spain. It was a collection of ambitions stitched together by accident and arrogance. Christian kingdoms in the north, Muslim caliphates in the south, and small principalities in between that often changed allegiance before the ink was dry. For nearly 8 centuries, the peninsula existed as a living argument, a shifting mosaic of languages, loyalties, and faiths. The map makers were never finished. Borders dissolved as fast as they were drawn. Castile eyed Leon, Aragon married into Navarre, and Granada, last jewel of Al-Andalus, glimmered at the edge of endurance. The people beneath those banners might have cared less about who ruled them than about whether it would rain before the harvest failed again. Yet for rulers and chroniclers, these shifting lines were destiny, proof that God, in one form or another, had chosen them to inherit dust. The climate decided more than politics ever could. In the high plains, the soil was thin and mean, forcing its people to be patient, thrifty, and suspicious of optimism. In the fertile valleys of the Guadalquivir, irrigation channels cut by Arab engineers turned the land into a garden, where oranges, figs, and pomegranates grew in the shadow of whitewashed walls. Along the coasts, salt filled the air, and ambition filled the harbours. Fishermen from Galicia mended their nets beside the cold Atlantic, while merchants in Barcelona and Valencia watched the horizon for ships from Africa, Italy, and Byzantium. Geography dictated belief as much as it did survival. Mountain villages worshipped saints who protected them from wolves and snow. Desert towns prayed for rain with the desperation of confession. And in the south, where the sun seemed eternal, time itself felt slower, measured not by the clock but by the call to prayer. Religion was the fabric and the friction of daily life. In Toledo, a church might stand beside a mosque built over a Roman temple, all three somehow surviving on the same plot of stubborn earth. Bells rang, muezzins called, and the hum of the marketplace filled the silence between them. The Christian north prayed in Latin, the Muslim south in Arabic, the Jewish communities in Hebrew. Each convinced their words rose higher than the others. Yet on feast days and market days, those same people might share bread, gossip, or even music, because hunger and habit are older than theology. A Christian woman might buy her spices from a Muslim trader who had borrowed the scales from his Jewish neighbour, and by the end of the transaction, all three could agree that no one was getting a fair price. In cities like Cordoba and later Seville, the architecture itself seemed to argue and reconcile at once. Domes and minarets rose above courtyards of marble fountains, while churches sprouted within the shells of former mosques. Even the air seemed layered, incense from chapels mingling with the scent of orange blossom and the sharp smoke of olive wood fires. Streets wound in tight, deliberate confusion, as though designed to make strangers lose their way and locals feel clever for finding theirs. Behind latticed windows, women watched the world through patterns of shadow, their presence hidden but constant. In the courtyards below, water murmured through stone channels, a quiet luxury in a land where thirst was an old companion. The population itself was a study in compromise. Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived within sight of one another, each maintaining customs that alternately inspired fascination and irritation. Language bent around necessity. Arabic merchants learned Castilian numbers. Christian clerks borrowed Moorish words for trade. Jewish physicians wrote in Latin to treat Muslim patients. The result was a kind of uneasy literacy, a peninsula that spoke in many tongues yet somehow managed to understand itself. Tolerance, when it existed, was less a virtue than an arrangement, a recognition that neighbours were cheaper than wars. But when politics turned sour, coexistence evaporated overnight, and the same streets that once echoed with music could fill just as easily with the sound of running feet. Power, as always, was concentrated in towers, royal courts perched on hilltops, eyeing the countryside like hawks. In Leon, in Burgos, in Granada, rulers issued decrees about justice, morality, and taxation that rarely reached the villages they imagined governing. Their castles were symbols of authority, but also of insecurity. Behind their walls, noblemen plotted marriages and betrayals, while clerics debated whether conquest was an act of faith or appetite. Each dynasty claimed divine favour, each fell with approximately the same speed. For every banner raised in triumph, another was lowered in surrender. The chronicles spoke of destiny, but the peasants who hauled stones for those castles might have called it seasonal work. If there was one thing everyone agreed on, it was that the land itself was worth the trouble. Andalusia's fields could feed cities, Castile's flocks clothed half of Europe, Catalonia's ports opened to a Mediterranean glittering with opportunity and plague. From the peaks of the Sierra Nevada, a traveller could see across orchards and rivers to the shimmering haze of the sea, a view that promised peace, though none ever lasted. Spain even then was both paradise and battlefield. Every generation inherited a patchwork quilt, already frayed at the edges, and every generation believed they were the ones to mend it. History suggests they were wrong. Still, for all its uncertainty, the peninsula thrived in its own restless way. Trade routes pulsed like veins. Pilgrims trudged towards Santiago de Compostela. Poets recited in palaces and taverns alike. Life went on between wars, and often in spite of them. The land was too generous and too demanding to allow otherwise. From sunrise over the Alhambra's red stone to sunset behind the grey towers of Leon, there was beauty enough to keep the faithful devout and the skeptics quiet. Everyone agreed Spain was beautiful. They simply couldn't agree on who owned it. And while kings and scholars argued over maps and scripture, Most of the people who actually lived on this beautiful, disputed soil had more immediate concerns: the price of grain, the threat of drought, and whether there'd be enough bread to last through winter. Beyond the walls of the cities and the ambitions of rulers, the real Spain waited, fields of hard earth and harder labour, where the day began and ended in the same bent posture. It is there, among the furrows and the silence, that the story of ordinary life begins. The peasant's year began and ended in the same place, the field. Life unfolded in rhythm with the seasons, and those rhythms were as unrelenting as the sun. In spring, the air filled with the smell of damp soil and the sound of wooden ploughs dragged by weary oxen. The work was patient, heavy, and circular. Plough, sow, pray, wait. By summer, heat shimmered over the plains, and the fields seemed to hum with insects and resignation. Autumn brought harvest, a brief festival of motion and exhaustion, when entire villages bent over the earth, hoping the yield would last long enough to make winter survivable. And then came the cold months, when smoke curled from low chimneys, the larders thinned, and everyone pretended not to notice how little food remained. Time was less a line than a wheel, and every turn came with the same familiar creak. Most peasants were bound to the land they worked, though not in chains. Serfdom was a kind of contractual captivity. They weren't slaves, but freedom was largely theoretical. The lord owned the soil, the tools, the grain, and the right to complain. The peasant owned his muscles and whatever God might owe him for persistence. The arrangement worked because it had to. In return for access to fields, protection from bandits, and a place to bury their dead, peasants owed labour, a portion of their crops, and a reverent silence about the fairness of the system. A modern observer might call it tenancy. A medieval one might call it divine order. The peasants themselves called it life and got on with it. Their homes were simple and loyal to gravity. Low stone or mud walls, thatched roofs, and floors of beaten earth that smelled of smoke and livestock. Light came through narrow slits, more suggestion than window, and furniture was mostly whatever the family hadn't burned for warmth. Every object served 2 or 3 purposes. A stool could be a step, a cradle, or kindling. The central hearth was both kitchen and shrine, the one place where flame gave shape to comfort. In winter, families and animals shared the same room for warmth, separated only by a wall of stubborn good intentions. Privacy was as rare as leisure, and both were regarded with mild suspicion. Work began before sunrise and ended when the sky went black. Men trudged to the fields carrying tools that had been repaired more times than they'd been made. Wooden ploughs cut the soil shallowly, their iron tips dull from years of hard earth. Oxen groaned, flies swarmed, and the rhythm of the day was marked by the slow clatter of bells. Not clocks, but church towers, reminding everyone how time was supposed to feel holy. The sound carried across the valley, muffled by distance but clear enough to remind even the most distracted labourer that his effort was not entirely his own. The fields themselves were patchwork, narrow strips divided by ownership, inheritance, and stubbornness. A single farmer might sow wheat in one lord's plot, barley in another's, and graze sheep on common ground, provided he could remember which patch of soil was whose. Boundaries were less about fences and more about arguments, and most villages maintained an informal economy of apologies to keep the peace. Disputes were frequent but small, rarely worth the attention of officials who lived too far away to care. Justice, when it arrived, tended to favour whoever could read Latin or owned a sword. Rain, when it came, was both miracle and menace. Too little, and the crops shriveled. Too much, and the fields turned to lakes. The smell of wet soil was both promise and warning, proof that nature remembered them, though not always kindly. Drought could last for years, famine for months, and recovery for generations. A good harvest meant survival. A poor one meant migration or burial. Yet even in failure, the cycle repeated. Seeds were saved, prayers were renewed, and hope, like the weeds, always grew back. The church reinforced this endurance with sermons on humility, reminding peasants that patience was rewarded in heaven, though rarely on earth. Faith filled the gaps that grain could not. The village church was usually the only stone building in sight, its bell a reminder of both salvation and schedule. Festivals broke the monotony with ritual, drink, and borrowed joy. Saints' days offered excuses to rest muscles and test livers, while processions turned dusty lanes into brief carnivals of colour and confusion. People prayed for rain, protection, and mercy, often in that order. Even the most sceptical farmer knew better than to insult the saints. They had long memories and terrible tempers. Across the peninsula, peasants were not a single people, but a collage of faiths and dialects. In the Christian north, villagers crossed themselves before meals and feared the devil. In the Muslim south, farmers greeted the dawn with quiet recitations, their fields irrigated by networks of canals that turned dust into gardens. In the borderlands, those restless frontiers where kingdoms collided, conversion was sometimes a matter of convenience. A man might change religion as easily as allegiance if it meant keeping his land or his life. Underneath the oaths, however, the labour remained the same. Wheat didn't care who prayed over it. In frontier villages, coexistence was pragmatic rather than philosophical. A Muslim ploughman might lend his oxen to a Christian neighbour, and both would grumble about the tax collector in roughly the same tone. Shared hardship had a way of softening theology. Across faiths, the smell of sweat and soil was identical, and so was the dull ache of bending over furrows for a lifetime. Differences returned only at sunset, when prayers rose in different directions, some toward Mecca, others toward heaven, though all carried the same quiet plea, that tomorrow's weather might be merciful. Children learned their place early. Boys followed their fathers into the fields, pretending to steer ploughs long before their arms were strong enough. Girls learned to grind grain, spin wool, and keep fires alive. Education was practical and brief. Most could count livestock but not words. Stories and songs filled the gap, passed down orally like tools worn smooth by many hands. The tales were of saints, spirits, and the occasional fool who tried to outwit hunger. None ended particularly well, but they passed the evenings until the fire burned low. Diet was predictable, but sufficient in good years. Dark bread, onions, olives, beans, and the occasional scrap of salted fish. Meat was a holiday luxury, unless one of the animals died of something inconveniently natural. Meals were eaten in silence more often than conversation, broken only by the sound of chewing and gratitude. Hunger, when it came, was endured without dramatics. The body learned to make do, and so did the spirit. For all their poverty, peasants understood the mathematics of a survival better than any noble accountant. The peasant's world was small but complete, bounded by the edge of the field, the roof above the hearth, and the rumours from the nearest town. Beyond that horizon lay kings, wars and wonders, but those belonged to other people. Theirs was a universe measured in seasons and stomachs. To the chroniclers who wrote history, these lives barely existed. To the land, they were everything. They were the ones who turned sunlight into bread and fatigue into prayer, who bent their backs so that others might stand taller. When the men came home from the fields, shoulders bent and hands stained with earth, the work inside the cottage had already been underway for hours. The small fire in the hearth glowed low and steady, tended since dawn by the women who kept the household alive. Theirs was a labour without pause or ceremony, the kind that vanished into routine so completely it was almost invisible. While the men pushed ploughs through the fields, the women turned grain into bread, flax into cloth, and children into something resembling adults. The rhythm of their lives followed no season and no Sabbath. It was an unbroken circle of feeding, mending and waiting, the quiet machinery that kept everything else from falling apart. The first task of the day was usually the millstone. Grain from the harvest, barley, wheat, or whatever could be spared, was poured into the hollow of the stone and ground by hand, the rough sound filling the dim room like a kind of low domestic thunder. The work was slow and repetitive, the stone turning until the arms ached and the floor dusted over in fine white powder. Once ground, the flour was mixed with water and salt, kneaded and baked over the coals until it became bread, the one luxury everyone could afford to knead. A peasant family might eat the same loaf for 3 days, softer on the first and hard enough to hammer nails by the last. Bread was so essential that running out of it was not just hunger, it was shame. Around the hearth, every surface carried a purpose. Clay pots hung above the smoke-blackened fire pit. Woven baskets lined the walls, holding lentils, onions, and dried herbs. The smell inside was a mingling of heat, ash, and human effort, a perfume of survival. Children hovered nearby, curious until they were old enough to be useful. Babies slept wrapped in wool beside the warmth, while older daughters spun thread or plucked feathers for stuffing bedding. The room was small, the air thick with labour, and yet it was here that the family's economy truly lived. Everything eaten, worn or traded began its life in this cramped space. The food was humble but deliberate. Bread and olives were the daily constants, washed down with watered wine or goat's milk. Chickpeas, lentils and beans filled the gaps between hope and meat. Salted fish, carried in from the coasts by traders with strong stomachs, was the nearest thing to a delicacy, its smell announcing its presence long before the taste justified the price. Garlic flavoured nearly everything, perhaps to mask what one suspected it shouldn't. Stew was the universal answer to hunger. Vegetables, beans, and the occasional scrap of pork boiled into submission. Banquets were for the nobility. Everyone else just hoped the stew contained something identifiable. In these homes, housework was not a chore, but the foundation of existence. Every repair delayed poverty, every stitch postponed disaster. Clothing was patched until the original fabric became a rumour. Wool was spun on simple spindles and dyed with herbs, or roots that gave it the colour of patience, browns, greys and faded reds. Linen, where available, was prized for its strength and its ability to absorb both sweat and time. A woman's dowry was often measured, not in coins but in cloth, proving that the line between love and inventory was thin. The tasks required no audience and received no applause, but they kept hunger and nakedness politely at bay. Childbirth was the most dangerous form of labour, though it was rarely treated as exceptional. Babies arrived in the same rooms where bread was baked and clothes were mended. Midwives, women of long experience and uncertain reputation, guided the process with calm fatalism. Death in childbirth was common enough that prayers were recited with the same regularity as recipes. A mother who survived was expected to resume her duties almost immediately, the miracle of life swiftly replaced by the necessity of laundry. Infants were swaddled tightly, partly for warmth and partly because movement was considered suspicious. Many did not live long, but those who did became new labourers in a world that never ran short of work. The domestic economy extended beyond the walls of the home. Women kept small gardens of herbs and vegetables, guarded as fiercely as treasure. They raised chickens and goats, traded eggs or milk with neighbours, and sometimes sold surplus at the village market for a handful of coins or a measure of grain. What little money they earned rarely stayed in their hands. It went to the priest, the tax collector, or the merchant who sold salt and candles. Yet the act of earning it mattered. It was proof that the home could stretch a little further than its own shadow. Even in poverty, there was a strange kind of independence, in knowing the household would not collapse entirely without them. The sounds of domestic life formed a background hum to the countryside. The steady creak of spinning wheels, the scrape of knives on boards, the hiss of boiling stew, the rhythmic thud of grain against stone. These were the sounds of civilization in miniature. Outside, bells marked the hours of prayer, but inside, time was measured by how much dough had risen, or how many shirts still waited to be mended. When daylight faded, candles or oil lamps took over, casting small golden halos that turned the smoke into visible air. In the half-light, faces seemed older, lines deepened, and eyes reflected the shimmer of the fire. The only luxury no one could live without. Marriage for a peasant woman was less romance than partnership in labour. Love was optional, endurance was not. Husbands worked the fields, wives the hearth, and between them they built a fragile balance of necessity. A wife's authority was strongest where it was least visible, in deciding when to stretch a meal, how to budget flour, or which child might be old enough to help at the loom. Domestic quarrels rarely reached the outside world, though the occasional shout might carry across the yard and remind the neighbours that harmony, like bread, required constant kneading. Faith entered the home in small ways. Crosses hung near the door, saints' images watched from shelves, and candles were lit for protection against both illness and chance. In Muslim households, prayers marked the hours, and verses from the Quran were painted above doorways for blessing. Jewish families marked the Sabbath by lighting lamps and setting aside the best of their modest meals, proof that holiness could exist even in hunger. Across faiths the gestures were similar, a whispered hope that divine attention might glance kindly upon a roof held up by effort and smoke. Winter was the true test. The days shortened, the stores dwindled, and the fire had to be coaxed into lasting longer than the woodpile suggested. Women rationed everything: grain, warmth, patience. Neighbours helped when they could, though charity was often a circle, one starving family feeding another in the faith that kindness might one day return the favour. When illness swept through the village, it was the women who tended the fevered and buried the fallen, then rose the next morning to bake more bread. Their mourning had no leisure. Life required continuity. To outsiders, the priests, the lords, the officials, the cottage was a place of poverty. But to those inside it, it was the centre of all meaning. Within those dark, low walls, people were born, fed, clothed, healed, and remembered. The home was both a workshop and refuge, bound together by the persistence of those who lived in its dim glow. They had no illusions of grandeur, only the steady conviction that survival itself was a kind of prayer. And when by luck or good harvest, a family found itself with a little more than it needed, a basket of extra onions, a strip of cloth, a handful of olives, the home's economy stretched beyond its door. That surplus, rare and precious, carried them toward the marketplace and the uncertain promise of exchange, where the quiet labours of the countryside met the restless appetite of the town. The market was where everything the villages could not consume met everything the cities could not produce. It was an orchestra of noise, smell, and motion, as if the entire peninsula had gathered to rehearse the art of chaos. The air was thick with voices, haggling, praying, swearing, and laughing, often all at once. Every accent of Spain could be heard there, and quite a few from beyond. Arabic from the south, Catalan from the coast, Latin from clerks who liked to sound important, and the universal dialect of bargaining, which required no translation at all. At the heart of every town, square stood the market cross or fountain, surrounded by a shifting forest of stalls. Each was little more than a wooden table or a stretch of cloth propped on poles, but together they formed a maze of goods and tempers. The spice seller displayed his wares in small sacks: cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from India, saffron from La Mancha. proof that even in the Middle Ages, globalization could fit neatly in a pouch. Next door, the cloth merchant rolled out bolts of fabric dyed in every shade of ambition: scarlet for the wealthy, brown for the honest, grey for the resigned. The fishmonger shouted over the din, insisting that his catch was fresh despite the evidence provided by both eyes and nose. Somewhere between them, a butcher swatted flies with professional despair, and a baker sold bread that could double as weaponry. The smells competed with the sounds. Salt and tar from the docks, mixed with the sharp bite of vinegar and the sweetness of roasting meat. Smoke from charcoal braziers drifted over the crowd, mingling with the musk of animals, the sweat of labour, and the faint perfume of imported oils that merchants dabbed behind their ears in moments of optimism. The result was not unpleasant, merely honest, the fragrance of a society that lived by exchange and endurance. It was said you could find anything in a Spanish market if you had the money, the nerve, and the right saint on your side. The merchants themselves formed a separate caste, equal parts respected and distrusted. They were the arteries of the economy, and like arteries, often clogged with greed. Christian traders dominated the northern routes, bringing wool, salt and timber from Castile and Leon. Muslim merchants controlled the southern caravans, importing silk, sugar and spices through Almeria and Malaga. Between them stood the Jewish middlemen and financiers, whose knowledge of numbers and languages allowed the entire system to function, and whose success guaranteed they would be blamed for its failures. Together, they formed a kind of uneasy partnership, bound not by faith but by profit. The city owed its prosperity to the constant friction between them, a dynamic that was both lucrative and combustible. Money changed hands in 3 languages and half a dozen metals. In Al-Andalus, dirhams and dinars, silver and gold coins stamped with Arabic calligraphy were the standard. In the Christian kingdoms, the Maravidi reigned, though its value was less a matter of arithmetic than imagination. Exchange rates varied not only from town to town, but sometimes from morning to afternoon. Weights and measures were even less reliable. A pound of flour might depend on the scale, the weather, and the merchant's conscience. Credit existed as a polite fiction shared by optimists, its success dependent on memory, trust, and the hope that no one would die before repayment. Promissory notes circulated among traders like whispered rumours, often worth less than the ink used to sign them. Markets were also the social calendar of the poor. On feast days and market days, villagers arrived in droves, their produce packed in baskets or slung over donkeys. They sold eggs, herbs, woven cloth, and whatever dignity remained after haggling. A day's profit might buy salt, oil, or a candle. Luxuries measured in ounces and patience. Children chased chickens through the crowd. Dogs barked at everything with conviction, and beggars occupied the doorways like permanent fixtures. Some begged in the name of saints, others in the name of hunger. Both found customers in roughly equal numbers. The blind sang ballads, the lame displayed their misfortune, and pickpockets worked among them with theological detachment, redistributing wealth 1 purse at a time. Above this sea of humanity, the town officials presided with an air of bureaucratic exhaustion. The alguacil, a kind of market constable, tried to maintain order with the help of a stick and the illusion of authority. Inspectors checked the weights, scribes noted the taxes, and priests circulated discreetly to ensure that morality, like commerce, remained adequately supervised. In theory, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish traders were subject to the same laws. In practice, each answered to whoever collected their taxes, and most considered that sufficient piety for the week. Toledo, Seville, and Valencia were the jewels of this mercantile world, cities that grew not by conquest, but by trade. Toledo, once a Visigothic capital and later a Muslim stronghold, became a melting pot where merchants, translators, and theologians shared the same streets, often uncomfortably. Seville, closer to the sea, thrived on the flow of goods between Africa and Europe. Its docks groaned under the weight of barrels and ambition, while its narrow streets echoed with the cries of sailors who swore fluently in several languages. Valencia, meanwhile, balanced between orchard and ocean, exporting silk and citrus to anyone with coin enough to pay. Each city bore the marks of prosperity and decay in equal measure. Fine architecture beside crumbling walls, wealth beside want, splendour beside stench. The market was not only about goods, but about gossip. News travelled faster than ships, carried on tongues eager for drama. Rumours of wars, famines, and royal marriages passed from one stall to another, embroidered at every retelling. A merchant could learn more about the state of the kingdom by listening to women barter for onions than by reading a dozen royal decrees. Information was its own currency, and unlike gold, it could be multiplied by sharing. The best merchants traded in both. For many, the market also served as a stage for display. Wealth was meant to be seen. Silks, jewellery, and well-fed horses were advertisements of success. Even modest traders adopted the gestures of confidence. A louder voice, a cleaner tunic, a ring that might have been brass pretending to be gold. The line between respectability and vanity was as thin as parchment. To be seen spending was often as valuable as spending wisely. Reputation was the surest collateral in a world where fortunes turned as easily as coins. Despite the noise and competition, there was a certain rhythm to it all, a choreography that held chaos together. Sellers called, buyers countered, deals were struck, and grudges postponed until next week. Beneath the arguments lay an understanding that everyone was playing the same game, and that no one, not even the cleverest trader, could win it for long. The market was an ecosystem sustained by motion. As soon as the shouting stopped, so would the city's heartbeat. By dusk, the day's frenzy faded into exhaustion. Merchants packed their goods, counting coins by the flickering light of torches. The square emptied slowly, leaving only the scent of trampled herbs and the echo of promises made too cheaply. Dogs scavenged for scraps, and the beggars settled into corners, their bowls as empty as their prayers. Somewhere, a bell marked the evening hour, its tone drifting above the rooftops like a benediction for the weary and the overcharged alike. By the time the market emptied and the last coin had changed hands, the real work of the city had only just begun. Behind the quiet of closed shutters and locked gates, the hum of labour continued, steady, rhythmic, and essential. The artisans were the pulse of the town, their crafts providing everything from horseshoes to holy relics, from boots to bells. If the market was the face of the city, bright and loud and full of promises, then the workshops were its heart, cramped, smoky, and beating to the rhythm of hammer and hand. Every trade had its place, and every craftsman his guild. These guilds were not merely clubs or professional associations. They were miniature governments, ruling their members with the zeal of small kings. A guild decided who could work, what they could charge, and even when they were allowed to take a day off. The system was meant to preserve standards, prevent chaos, and, most importantly, ensure that nobody's success came at the expense of another's comfort. Regulations covered everything from the width of a shoe sole to the thickness of a candle. A guild could fine you for working too poorly, but also for working too well. Excellence, after all, was considered antisocial. Becoming a craftsman required patience that bordered on sainthood. Every profession began with an apprentice, a boy, usually between 10 and 14, sent to live with a master craftsman. He slept in the workshop, ate what his master's wife could spare, and learned his trade through repetition and blisters. Apprenticeship was less about creativity and more about endurance. For 7 years or so, the boy fetched tools, stoked fires, cleaned up spills, and gradually earned the right to touch the materials themselves. When he finally achieved competence and the master's tolerance, he became a journeyman. The journeyman's name came from the French journey, a day's work, because he was paid by the day and was expected to travel, learning from different masters in different towns. This wandering life was as educational as it was exhausting. Journeymen carried letters of recommendation, like passports, seeking workshops that would hire them and roofs that would shelter them. Their wages were modest, their hours long, and their hopes usually pinned on the distant dream of becoming a master themselves, a dream that required both skill and luck. Only after presenting a masterpiece, a finished work judged perfect by the guild elders, could a journeyman be admitted into the ranks of mastery. The masterpiece was not just proof of talent, it was an initiation into bureaucracy. Inside the workshops, the air was thick with dust, smoke, and a kind of sacred noise. The blacksmith's forge glowed like an altar, sparks leaping into the dark as hammers struck iron into obedience. The smell of hot metal mixed with sweat and ash, filling the narrow lanes with a warmth that clung to skin and memory. A few doors down, the tanner's yard was less poetic. Hides soaked in vats of water and lime, then scraped clean with knives under the open sky. The stench could humble a saint, but the work paid well enough that neighbours merely complained instead of moving. Dyers boiled cloth in great cauldrons of colour, deep indigo, madder red and yellow, from saffron or onion skins. Their hands were perpetually stained, as though the pigments had decided that ownership went both ways. The carpenter's shop offered a different rhythm, saws rasping, wood shavings curling to the floor like parchment. The masons' guild worked outdoors, chiselling stone for cathedrals that would outlive them all. Potters shaped clay into the vessels that held the city's food, water, and occasionally its gossip. Tailors sewed in dim rooms where sunlight fell through latticework, cutting cloth so carefully that waste was considered a moral failing. The sound of labour filled every alley, the clang of metal, the slap of wet hides, the steady thunk of a mallet on wood. Each craft had its own music, its own smell, its own form of prayer. Pride ran deep among artisans, even when their lives were small. A blacksmith could look at a gate or a horseshoe and know his work would survive storms and hooves alike. A mason might glance up at a cathedral wall and feel just for a moment that he had cheated time. Yet pride often shared the same bench as monotony. A man who made nails made nothing else. A woman who wove cloth did so every day for 30 years, until her fingers knew the pattern better than her mind. Craftsmanship offered dignity, but it rarely offered change. The same motion that created beauty also dulled the spirit. The guilds tried to protect their trades from both innovation and ruin. Foreigners were welcome only if they brought something new that could be safely claimed as local tradition within a generation. Secret techniques were guarded like family heirlooms, passed only to apprentices who had proved both loyalty and silence. The guild charters, often written on parchment thicker than the bread most members ate, detailed fines for every imaginable offence, selling outside official markets, working after hours, using inferior materials, or, worst of all, charging less than the fixed price. Competition was considered vulgar. The goal was stability, not ambition. Yet for all their rigidity, the guilds were also social worlds. Feasts were held on saints' days, complete with drinking, music, and arguments about whose work truly honoured Saint Eligius or Saint Joseph. Masters contributed to the upkeep of churches, hospitals, and sometimes even orphanages, a form of civic pride that conveniently doubled as advertising. Apprentices marched in processions, carrying their tools as banners, while journeymen flirted with washerwomen in doorways, pretending that skill would one day make up for poverty. Each trade had its own patron saint and its own hierarchy of envy. Beneath the pride, however, lay anxiety. The city depended on artisans, yet they remained perpetually vulnerable to famine, war, and politics. When plague struck, work stopped. When kings taxed, guilds protested. When fashions changed, entire trades collapsed overnight. A shoemaker might spend a lifetime perfecting a style, only to find that next year's nobles preferred Italian imports. The dignity of labour was real, but so was the fragility of its reward. A man might die with the satisfaction of knowing he had done his craft well, and the equal certainty that his name would be forgotten within a month. Still, the artisans carried on, their work forming the quiet infrastructure of civilization. They repaired tools, built bridges, mended saddles, and kept the town functional, while its rulers debated theology and glory. Their legacy was not in names but in objects: the hinge that didn't rust, the cup that didn't crack, the wall that didn't fall. The world was held together by such details, even if few paused to notice. At the end of a long day, the workshops dimmed one by one, the fires cooling to embers. The masters locked their doors, the apprentices swept the floors, and the journeymen washed their hands in water that turned grey with ash and dye. Above the smoke and sweat of the workshops, where hammers rang and dye pots steamed, the air grew cleaner, not purer exactly, but more perfumed. In the high towers of stone that watched over the towns and the fields beyond them, another world began. Here lived the nobility, whose calloused hands were the result of wearing too many jewelled rings rather than any brush with labour. They were the visible summit of feudal society, a system best described as one long chain of obligation, in which everyone owed loyalty to someone richer. Peasants served their lords, lords served their kings, and kings, in theory, served God. Though he was rarely consulted about the arrangement, feudalism was a kind of organised dependency, elegant on parchment and chaotic in practice. A noble's authority came from land, not competence. The crown granted them estates, the estates produced wealth, and that wealth sustained the illusion that ruling required more intelligence than inheritance. Each noble house functioned as a small kingdom, complete with servants, retainers, chaplains, and soldiers who were bound by oaths as fragile as they were sacred. In exchange for loyalty and military service, the nobleman received the right to tax his tenants, administer justice, and decorate his coat of arms with increasingly optimistic animals. It was a world of hierarchy maintained by ceremony, custom, and an unspoken agreement never to ask who, if anyone, deserved their place within it. Castle life was a curious mixture of grandeur and boredom. From a distance, a castle looked invincible, walls thick enough to mock time, towers built to catch both wind and admiration. Inside, it was less romantic. Cold halls, smoky hearths, and draughts that ignored lineage. Tapestries covered the stone walls, not merely as decoration, but as insulation, depicting battles the family may or may not have won. Floors were strewn with rushes that disguised the dirt but not the smell. Furniture was scarce but ornate, the kind of craftsmanship peasants might spend a lifetime perfecting but never see. Servants drifted through the corridors like shadows, their presence acknowledged only when their absence caused inconvenience. A nobleman's daily schedule was heavy with the responsibilities of leisure. Mornings began late, with bread, wine, and complaints about the weather. There might follow a hunt through the forests, where falcons and hounds did most of the work, while the hunters congratulated each other on their skill. In the afternoons, disputes over land or inheritance were heard, often settled less by justice than by rank. Evenings brought feasts in the great hall, with minstrels singing, goblets overflowing, and gossip travelling faster than the servants refilling the jugs. Their duties included hunting, hosting, and ensuring that peasants stayed devoutly poor. The lady of the castle managed the domestic sphere, which was far grander but no less demanding than the peasant's cottage. She oversaw the kitchens, the storerooms, and the servants who attended the endless needs of the household. Her mornings were filled with embroidery, correspondence, and the subtle politics of alliances, who to flatter, who to ignore, and who to marry off advantageously. Noble women were expected to be pious, graceful, and decorative, though within those confines they exercised a surprising degree of power. A lady's approval could make or unmake reputations, and her gossip was often sharper than her husband's sword. Tournaments were the nobility's preferred form of chaos, a socially acceptable way to wound one another while pretending it was for sport. Knights paraded in gleaming armour that cost as much as a village, while the crowd cheered and wagered on who would unhorse whom. The jousts were as much theatre as combat, full of banners, music, and deliberate pageantry. Injuries were common, deaths occasional, and victory eternal only in song. Between bouts, troubadours sang of love and honour, virtues seldom observed but greatly admired. Courtly love, that refined art of longing without satisfaction, gave the idle something to feel deeply about between meals. Feasts were exercises in abundance and hierarchy. Tables groaned beneath roasted meats, pastries and wine, imported from wherever wine was fashionable that century. The nobility prided themselves on refinement, though their manners often lagged behind their appetites. Napkins were an emerging idea, and knives were shared enthusiastically. Perfumes and scented gloves helped mask the less noble realities of hygiene. Conversation was an art form, as was flattery, and both could be fatal if poorly executed. To dine in a noble hall was to perform as much as to eat, to laugh at the right jokes, praise the right host, and appear suitably amazed by the imported figs. Clothing served as both armour and advertisement. Velvet, silk, and brocade declared status more clearly than any title. Dyes were expensive, patterns dictated by fashion, and vanity in equal measure. Embroidery displayed wealth as much as taste, each stitch a reminder that someone else's eyes and fingers had laboured for months to make it possible. Jewellery was less accessory than statement. Rings, brooches, and jewelled belts glittered beneath candlelight, turning dinner into an exhibition of reflected light. The noble body was a kind of currency, clothed, perfumed, and presented to prove its value. For all their luxury, nobles lived under a constant shadow of fear. Their castles were built for defence because attack was never far away. From rival lords, angry peasants, or kings who needed their land more than their loyalty, rebellion simmered in the countryside like an unwatched pot, and alliances changed as easily as seasons. Marriages, meant to unite families, often sowed the seeds of future feuds. Even in peacetime, paranoia was a virtue. Guests could be spies, servants could be thieves, and relatives could be both. Power was always borrowed, never owned outright, and every privilege came with a quiet reminder of how quickly it could vanish. The nobility justified their comfort through the language of divine order. They ruled because God, in his mysterious wisdom, preferred hierarchy to equality. The clergy confirmed this arrangement, preaching that each soul had its appointed place, from the peasant bent in the fields to the count reclining in silk. Charity soothed the conscience, a donation to the church here, a coin for a beggar there, ensuring that generosity never became habit. For many nobles, piety was measured in architecture. Chapels built beside bedchambers stained glass windows depicting saints, whose virtues they had no intention of imitating. Amid the politics and posturing, some nobles found genuine pleasure in patronage. They sponsored builders, painters, and musicians, financing beauty as proof of their refinement. Monks were commissioned to illuminate manuscripts, architects to raise cathedrals, and poets to immortalize their benefactors in verse. A noble might be remembered less for ruling wisely than for having funded a particularly impressive ceiling. Art softened the image of power. It made cruelty look cultured. And in a world where memory was the only immortality on offer, beauty was simply another form of armour. For all their wealth, few nobles truly escaped the tedium of safety. They longed for adventure, but feared the consequences. They valued honour, but practised caution. They admired chivalry while negotiating loopholes in its code. Their lives were a careful performance, each gesture rehearsed to maintain dignity and distance. The peasants feared them, the artisans envied them, and the clergy flattered them. But behind the walls of their castles, nobles were often just as restless and uncertain as those they ruled. When the feasts ended and the torches burned low, the great halls fell into silence, broken only by the echo of footsteps on stone. The tapestries swayed faintly in the draughts, their woven battles forever frozen in triumph. In the mornings, bells rang from the castle chapel. Their sound drifted far beyond noble walls, echoing down into valleys, across fields, and into cloisters of stone, where another rhythm ruled entirely. In the monasteries scattered across medieval Spain, time itself belonged to God. The monks who lived there marked their days not by sunlight or harvest, but by the rule of Saint Benedict, a system so thorough it governed everything from when to pray to how long to speak, which ideally was never. Their motto was simple and unrelenting: ora et labora, pray and work. The balance varied depending on the weather, the abbot, and the number of chores, but the spirit remained the same. While nobles chased honour and peasants chased survival, monks pursued something harder to define: holiness through repetition. The monastery was both a refuge from the world and a world unto itself. From the outside, its high walls suggested isolation, but within them existed a complex organism of prayer, labour, and quiet ambition. At dawn, before the mist had lifted from the hills, the brothers rose from their hard wooden cots and filed into the chapel for matins, the first of 8 daily prayers that divided the day like a slow-moving clock. The chants began in near darkness, Latin syllables rising and falling like waves, reminding all who listened that eternity had a schedule. After the final Amen, they returned to their tasks, some to the fields, some to the kitchens, others to the scriptorium, where silence was not merely encouraged, but enforced by glances that could curdle milk. The rule demanded humility, obedience, and moderation, though few agreed on the definition of the last. Meals were eaten in silence, while one brother read from Scripture or the life of a saint, often one who had suffered impressively. The food was plain: bread, beans, cheese, and fish when possible, though abbots tended to interpret plain generously. Wine was permitted in moderation, which could mean anything from a sip to a jug depending on the abbey's location and success in viticulture. Even the ascetic found it hard to pray on an empty stomach. Every day moved in a circle: prayer, labour, study, and rest. The hours of devotion, punctuated by the ringing of bells, that divided time into small obedient pieces. Despite their vows of poverty, monasteries were rarely poor. Over the centuries, noble families eager to improve their odds in the afterlife donated land, vineyards, mills, and even entire villages. They renounced possessions, one observer noted, which made them fabulously rich in land. Monks became expert administrators, collecting rents and managing estates with the efficiency of accountants who had read too much theology. Peasants who worked monastery land found their landlords far more literate but no less insistent on payment. By the 12th century, some abbeys owned herds of cattle, fleets of fishing boats, and libraries worth more than most towns. The brothers may have prayed for humility, but they kept excellent records of income. The scriptorium was the centre of monastic intellect. There, under flickering lamplight, scribes bent over parchment made from the hides of animals that had died nobly for literature. The air smelled of ink, wax, and patient frustration. Each letter was drawn by hand, each line ruled by care, each mistake scraped away with a knife before the abbot noticed. Margins often filled with quiet rebellion, doodles, small jokes, and occasional prayers for shorter texts. Through this labour, the wisdom of centuries survived. Aristotle, Galen, Augustine, and the Psalms, all copied and recopied by men who measured progress one page at a time. To read was to commune with the dead. To write was to keep them company. Outside the cloister, monks managed gardens that provided both food and medicine. The herbalist tended rows of sage, rosemary, and rue, plants valued as much for symbolism as healing. The infirmary, staffed by brothers who had learned their medicine from the same books they copied, offered care to travellers and locals alike. Bleeding, purging, and prayer were standard treatments. Occasionally one worked, though never all three at once. In some monasteries, beer and wine were brewed to support the community and fund charity, which in practice meant further building projects. The monks of Cluny were famous for their cellars, Cistercians for their agriculture, and Benedictines for the sheer size of their granaries. A life devoted to simplicity, it turned out, required a great deal of management. Every monastery was also a refuge for the restless soul. Not all who entered were saints in waiting. Some were younger sons of nobility, unlikely to inherit but too well born to plough. Others were former soldiers seeking penance, widowers fleeing grief, or scholars weary of the world's noise. Within those walls, ambition took quieter forms, not conquest, but contemplation. Yet even monasteries had politics. Abbots wielded considerable authority, elected by their brothers, but often courted by kings. Disputes over doctrine, funding, or liturgical innovation could lead to schisms grand enough to merit papal attention. To live apart from the world did not mean to live free of it. The world had a habit of writing letters. Cathedrals, on the other hand, were the church's public face, monuments of stone and devotion that reached toward heaven while reminding everyone who financed salvation. In towns like Burgos, Leon, and Santiago de Compostela, spires rose above the roofs like spears pointing at eternity. Inside, light filtered through stained glass in colours that seemed more like air than a matter, illuminating marble saints who had long since ceased listening. Monks might renounce beauty in theory, but bishops collected it with enthusiasm. The contradiction was not lost on them. It was perhaps the defining feature of faith in medieval Spain. Asceticism preaching from gilded pulpits, poverty robed in silk, humility singing through choirs funded by taxes. Pilgrims passed through these places like living rivers, carrying their hopes, diseases, and coins from shrine to shrine. Monks hosted them in guest houses, offering beds of straw and bowls of thin stew in exchange for confessions and donations. The monastery was both sanctuary and business, balancing salvation and profit with the same steady hand. For the weary traveller, its walls promised safety. For the abbot, they promised income. Faith was never free, though it was always worth paying for. Yet for all their contradictions, the monasteries were the spiritual backbone of the land. Their bells marked the hours that governed both field and city. Their prayers rose for kings and beggars alike, and their manuscripts preserved the memory of civilizations long gone. Within their walls, Knowledge endured when war and famine erased nearly everything else. The monk's life was narrow but deep, focused on eternity rather than event. To outsiders it looked monotonous. To those inside, it was vast. A life spent staring through time's window at something infinite and unknowable. When the monks prayed for peace, the soldiers prayed for pay. Outside the cloisters, where bells marked hours of devotion, the rest of Spain lived by the sound of hooves and the clash of steel. For nearly 8 centuries, the peninsula existed in a state of unfinished war, a long, uneven struggle called the Reconquista. It began not as a crusade, but as a habit, a rolling frontier where kingdoms grew, shrank, and grew again, where land was won by daylight and lost by supper. From the early skirmishes of the 8th century to the fall of Granada in 1492, it was less a single war than a slow rearrangement of geography, faith, and exhaustion. Maps shifted like sand dunes, each victory celebrated as destiny, and each defeat explained as divine mystery. For the men who fought, the Reconquista was less about ideology and more about survival. They lived in camps that smelled of sweat, iron, and old smoke, sleeping under canvas or nothing at all. Food was whatever didn't run away first: salted pork, stale bread, and the occasional miracle of wine. Water skins leaked, boots rotted, and blisters turned to scars. Faith was as necessary as armour. Without it, no one could justify the endless discomfort. Priests followed the armies to bless the dying and bury the rest, and their sermons grew shorter with every campaign. For every saint on the battlefield, a weary chronicler once wrote, there were 5 sinners with better aim. The soldiers came from everywhere and believed in everything. Christian knights rode south from Castile, Leon, Aragon, and Navarre, their banners stitched with crosses and family pride. Moorish cavalry charged north from Granada and Córdoba, their armour glinting in the sun like a moving wall of mirrors. Between them stood mercenaries, men who fought for whoever fed them, and local militias, peasants, pressed into service with pikes that bent more than they pierced. Loyalty was a flexible commodity, and desertion a common form of diplomacy. One could die for faith, for gold, or for the promise of both. The outcome was usually the same. Knighthood carried its own mythology, a code of chivalry that sounded noble in poetry and impossible in practice. Knights were meant to be brave, pious, and courteous, except when killing, looting, or arguing over pay. They swore oaths before priests and broke them before breakfast. Their armour gleamed in tournaments, but rusted in real combat, and the heat beneath it could fell a man faster than an enemy's sword. Each knight was accompanied by a squire, a younger man who cleaned weapons, tended horses, and learned humility by observation. For the squire, chivalry began with carrying buckets and ended with carrying corpses. The Moorish cavalry brought a different kind of elegance to war. Their horses were light and fast, their tactics fluid, relying on speed rather than spectacle. They used curved sabres, composite bows, and the desert's patience, striking swiftly and disappearing before the Christians could untangle their armour straps. To the chroniclers of the north, these soldiers were both admired and condemned, enemies whose skill was inconveniently superior. The exchange of techniques, like the exchange of prisoners, became a tradition. Both sides learned from one another, even as they swore eternal opposition. For the commanders and kings, the Reconquista was a tapestry of opportunity. Victories brought land, titles, and tithes. Defeats brought excuses and new taxes. The church blessed each campaign as holy work, declaring indulgences for those who fought and forgiveness for those who financed it. Merchants supplied weapons and wine at divine markup, and scribes recorded every skirmish as though the fate of the world had hinged on it. War became both a spiritual calling and a business model. Each captured fortress was a sermon in stone, each burned village a footnote in the theology of conquest. In the camps, soldiers lived by improvisation. Fires burned low at night to avoid detection, and stories spread faster than lice. They spoke of saints who guided arrows, devils who whispered strategy, and generals who could make rainfall on command. Faith was elastic, stretched between desperation and superstition. A man might wear a cross on his chest and a charm in his boot, covering all metaphysical bases. Priests blessed swords before battle, and heard confessions after, sometimes from the same men who had just looted the nearest monastery. The line between sacred and profane was as thin as a blade's edge, and just as likely to cut both ways. The Reconquista advanced not in triumphs, but in trudges. Armies marched for months only to seize a hill, lose it again, and rebuild the same wall twice. The rhythm of conquest was measured in sieges, long stretches of waiting punctuated by moments of panic. Disease killed more men than swords, and boredom more than both. Winter brought hunger, summer brought rot, and spring brought mud that could swallow a horse whole. When victories came, they were celebrated with drunken fervour and forgotten by the next campaign. The enemy always regrouped, the frontier always shifted, and the soldiers always marched again. Among the ranks were crusaders from across Europe, French knights seeking adventure, Italian mercenaries seeking coin, and the occasional Englishman who had misunderstood the weather. They brought with them new weapons, diseases, and interpretations of piety. The papacy encouraged this influx, turning Spain into a proving ground for holy war. Success in battle could cleanse sins as effectively as confession, provided one died quickly. The reward for survival was often less spiritual. A small plot of confiscated land, a local wife, and a lifetime of explaining one's accent. In the cities behind the lines, war became the background noise of prosperity. Traders sold iron, salt, and wine to both sides, sometimes in the same week. Blacksmiths worked day and night, forging swords, arrowheads, and armour plates that would one day meet again on opposite ends of the same field. Even the monasteries profited, receiving donations from soldiers eager to bribe heaven in advance. Conflict was costly, but peace was unprofitable. The line between patriotism and opportunism was hard to see through the smoke. For the common soldier, life between battles was a blur of waiting, mending, and trying not to think too much. The sound of armour being repaired was the lullaby of the camps. The sight of vultures overhead, the morning's weather report, letters home were rare, literacy rarer, and news unreliable. Stories of valour were told by survivors who happened to be nearby. There was no glory in death, only the quiet redistribution of possessions. A good sword might outlive a dozen owners, each convinced it had been blessed. As the centuries passed, the Reconquista gathered its own mythology. Chronicles describe knights as saints, kings as saviours, and victories as divine proof that God preferred one language at a time. In truth, exhaustion did most of the work. Town by town, fortress by fortress, Muslim rule retreated southward, leaving behind architecture, language, and irrigation systems that would outlast every conqueror. When Granada finally fell in 1492, it was not a single victory, but the conclusion of an era spent grinding two civilizations into one tired inheritance. The aftermath of war was quieter, but no less complex. Soldiers laid down their weapons, priests blessed their graves, and kings divided spoils with bureaucratic precision. The frontier, once so alive with noise and faith, faded into memory. Yet something survived amid the ruins, a mingling of knowledge, language, and art carried by both conquerors and conquered. When the soldiers finally sheathed their swords and the dust of conquest settled, something quieter began to move across Spain. Not an army, but an idea. The smoke of war gave way to the glow of oil lamps, and the clang of steel was replaced by the soft rasp of quills against parchment. In the cities that had survived both battle and time, a different kind of campaign took root. One fought not for land or souls, but for understanding. This was the Spain of scholars and translators, a place where the languages of faith and reason briefly learned to share a desk. The armies had carved borders. Now the thinkers would try, against all odds, to cross them. The intellectual heart of this strange peace beat most strongly in Córdoba and Toledo, cities that shone like lanterns in the long medieval night. Córdoba, under Muslim rule, was the envy of Europe, a city of paved streets, running water, and libraries so vast that scholars joked the librarians were more numerous than the saints. It held schools of philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and poetry, where Muslim, Christian, and Jewish thinkers worked within walking distance of one another, if not always in harmony. Toledo, later reclaimed by Christian kings, inherited this legacy and expanded it. By the 12th century, it had become a crossroads where Arabic, Latin, and Hebrew coexisted uneasily but productively, each serving as a bridge to the others. If war had divided Spain, knowledge stitched it back together, at least for a time. The work of translation was both tedious and transcendent. Ancient Greek texts had come west through Arabic intermediaries, carried by scholars who had preserved them while the rest of Europe forgot they existed. In Toledo's scriptoria, one could find a curious collaboration. A Muslim scholar reading Aristotle aloud in Arabic, a Jewish translator explaining each phrase in the local tongue, and a Christian scribe copying the words into Latin line by careful line. The process resembled a liturgy, patient, reverent, and occasionally argumentative. Misunderstandings were frequent, but so were discoveries. A single misplaced word could change the course of medicine or philosophy. One scholar later remarked that the Middle Ages were dark only to those who forgot to light the candles. These candles burned long into the night. Inside cramped rooms lined with manuscripts and ink pots, men bent over parchment until their eyes ached. The air was heavy with wax, dust, and the faint smell of parchment scraped thin. A single mistake might mean hours of repair. Spilled ink was a tragedy on par with fire. Quills squeaked and broke, fingers cramped, and tempers shortened. Yet the labour continued, driven by the stubborn belief that understanding was a form of worship. Every diagram, every marginal note, every carefully drawn circle of the stars was an act of devotion, not to a god of conquest, but to one of order. The subject studied here would shape centuries to come. From Arabic texts came the works of Galen and Hippocrates, reborn in Latin to inform European medicine. Mathematical treatises from Persia introduced algebra and algorithms, words whose Arabic roots were a quiet reminder of where learning had travelled. Astronomers charted the heavens with instruments first designed in Baghdad, their tables predicting eclipses and equinoxes with unnerving accuracy. Philosophers rediscovered Aristotle's logic and struggled to reconcile it with Christian theology, producing questions that would trouble universities for generations. Knowledge, like conquest, proved contagious. Córdoba's libraries were themselves wonders of the age. The largest, said to contain hundreds of thousands of volumes, dwarfed the entire collection of most Christian kingdoms combined. Books were copied by hand, their pages illuminated with care and sometimes vanity, gold leaf for sacred texts, silver for science, colour for everything else. The scholars who walked among these shelves treated them as both weapon and sanctuary. In an age that worshipped relics, the written word was its most durable miracle. To hold a book was to hold proof that human curiosity could survive any empire. What made Spain unique was not only its scholarship, but its collaboration. For a few precarious generations, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian thinkers worked side by side, not as equals perhaps, but as partners in necessity. A philosopher might quote the Quran in a Latin manuscript, or a rabbi might annotate a Greek text with Hebrew glosses. Disputes were constant, and yet the conversation continued. For a time, knowledge was allowed to speak a language older than faith. The translators of Toledo became legends in their own right. Figures like Gerard of Cremona, who brought more than 70 Arabic works into Latin, and Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, whose commentaries on Aristotle would echo through universities long after his name was forgotten. Outside the scholarly circles, however, the peace was fragile. Suspicion never slept long in medieval Spain. The same rulers who financed translation also taxed, censored, and occasionally expelled the people who made it possible. Cooperation was tolerated when profitable and condemned when not. In public, priests warned against foreign learning. In private, they consulted it. Even the scholars themselves were not immune to the politics of belief. A wrong interpretation could be heresy, and heresy could be fatal. The pursuit of truth required both courage and plausible deniability. Still, for all its contradictions, the translation movement transformed Europe's understanding of itself. Through Spain, the continent inherited the intellectual wealth of Greece and the scientific precision of the Islamic world. Astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, and medicine all flowed northward, like tributaries feeding a long-dormant river. The Renaissance, centuries later, would owe its birth to these dimly lit rooms, where exhausted men copied lines they barely understood. Spain, once the frontier of faith, had become the frontier of reason. The atmosphere in these centres of learning was unlike that of any court or cathedral. The scholars who gathered there were not warriors or saints, but craftsmen of thought. Their weapons were logic, their victories measured in clarity. A successful translation was cause for celebration, sometimes even recorded in poetry. The bond between collaborators could be intense, a shared triumph against ignorance, though one often tempered by arguments over whose God deserved the credit. Knowledge, like wine, was best enjoyed before theology diluted it. In the evenings, when the city quieted and the lamps glowed in narrow streets, the sound of chanting from nearby monasteries mingled with the scratch of quills. From a distance, the two labours might have seemed identical, both seeking truth, both requiring discipline. Yet one aimed to preserve heaven, the other to understand earth. Together they formed the twin pillars of medieval Spain, faith and reason, endlessly arguing but unable to live apart. For all their brilliance, the scholars were not immortal. Fire, intolerance, and time would erase much of their work. Libraries burned, languages fell out of use, and entire collections vanished with the fall of cities. Yet some light survived, carried westward into France, Italy, and England. Seeds of curiosity scattered by the same winds that once carried the dust of war. The legacy of those translators endures not in monuments or tombs, but in the quiet persistence of ideas that refuse to die. In the same cities where scholars traded ideas and translators bridged worlds, another community thrived quietly within its own walls, close enough to hear the noise of the markets and the prayers of the cathedrals, yet always apart. The Jewish quarters of medieval Spain, known as Juderías, were small cities within cities, winding lanes too narrow for carts, whitewashed houses pressed shoulder to shoulder, and doors marked with discreet symbols of faith. Their walls provided both protection and containment. Inside them, generations of Jewish families built lives of learning, labour, and devotion, an existence balanced between privilege and peril. The Juderia was a world of constant motion and strict rhythm. In Córdoba, Toledo, and Seville, its streets filled early with the sounds of work. The ring of hammers from goldsmith shops, the chatter of merchants unpacking bolts of cloth, the murmur of scholars already arguing over a passage of scripture. There were bakeries that prepared bread without leaven, tailors who stitched garments, modest by law and habit, and apothecaries who mixed powders and oils in glass jars that glowed like jewels in the sunlight. Children ran errands between houses, dodging donkeys and water carriers. Women leaned from windows to exchange gossip or measure spices, and at dusk the smell of stewing lentils and onions drifted through the air. It was a neighbourhood that smelled of earth and effort, where every wall carried the memory of both safety and siege. Within each community stood its heart, the synagogue and the yeshiva, the study house. The synagogue was not merely a place of prayer, but the centre of life itself. Men gathered there to read, debate, and record. The cantor's voice carried through the air, chanting the psalms in Hebrew as candles flickered against plaster walls. The yeshiva, often adjoining, was where scholars and students wrestled with the Torah and the Talmud, arguing with the precision of lawyers and the passion of poets. Books were copied and passed hand to hand, their margins filled with notes in Hebrew, Arabic, or Castilian, depending on the century and ruler. Learning was not just a calling, it was protection, the belief that understanding could anchor a people in a world determined to move them. The professions of Spain's Jews reflected both their intellect and their exclusion. Laws often barred them from owning land, so they turned instead to trades that relied on mind rather than soil. Many became physicians, their skill in medicine sought by nobles, bishops, and caliphs alike. Jewish doctors studied the works of Galen and Ibn Sina, blending Greek, Arabic, and Hebrew knowledge into something uniquely Iberian. Financiers managed the wealth of kings who despised them, and merchants handled the trade networks that connected Africa, the Mediterranean, and Europe. Translators, fluent in the tongues of conquerors, moved between courts as intermediaries of language and law. A Jew could be indispensable in the morning and expelled by afternoon. Prosperity came easily enough, security never did. Inside the home, life followed a rhythm of ritual and restraint. The week built toward the Sabbath, a day of rest, reflection, and reprieve from the endless labour of survival. As the sun set on Friday, candles were lit, prayers spoken, and the world outside momentarily forgotten. The streets quieted, doors closed, and the faint hum of song rose through the night. Bread was blessed, wine shared, and time itself seemed to pause. The Sabbath was not only a holy day, but an act of defiance, a refusal to let the chaos of the world dictate every hour. Dietary laws shaped daily life with equal discipline. Pots and plates were kept separate for meat and dairy. Slaughter was conducted with prayer and precision. The smells of kosher kitchens were familiar and distinct. Roasted lamb, chickpeas simmered in olive oil, spiced wine warmed on cold evenings. Each meal was an affirmation of identity, a boundary as meaningful as the walls of the Juderia itself. Festivals marked the seasons, Passover with its unleavened bread and retold story of liberation, Sukkot with temporary shelters built under the open sky, and Yom Kippur with fasting and forgiveness that reminded every soul of its fragility. Community life was governed through the Kahal, a council of elders and rabbis who settled disputes, collected taxes, and enforced discipline. The Kahal kept meticulous records, births, marriages, deaths, debts, the paper trail of a people determined to remain orderly even when the world was not. It coordinated charity for widows and travellers, arranged dowries for poor brides, and occasionally negotiated with rulers for protection or leniency. Leadership required diplomacy as much as piety. for the kahal stood between the community and the authorities, translating not only language, but expectation. Relations with the outside world were shaped by what might politely be called the logic of tolerance. Under both Muslim and Christian rulers, coexistence was permitted when useful and prohibited when not. Under the Umayyad caliphs of Cordoba, Jews held positions of influence as physicians, advisors, and diplomats, enjoying what historians would later call a golden age. Under certain Christian monarchs, similar privileges appeared: temporary, conditional, and never guaranteed. Tolerance was a calculation, not a conviction. The same rulers who accepted Jewish taxes with gratitude could, at the faintest whisper of crisis, revoke every right they had granted. When times were stable, Jewish scholars contributed richly to the culture of Spain. Poets like Judah Halevi wrote verses that mingled Hebrew devotion with Andalusian melody, blending sorrow and beauty in equal measure. Philosophers such as Maimonides sought to reconcile reason and faith. Their work studied from Cairo to Paris long after their deaths. In cities like Granada and Toledo, Jewish architecture echoed both Islamic grace and Christian solidity. Carved wood ceilings, geometric stonework, courtyards open to air and light. Yet beneath this flourishing ran a deep awareness that history had a short attention span. Prosperity was a borrowed garment, admired until it became envied. The pattern repeated itself across centuries. Periods of peace ended abruptly, with edicts of expulsion, forced conversions, or the eruption of mobs. In one decade, Jews might be praised as the kingdom's most useful citizens. In the next, they were blamed for plague, drought, or divine displeasure. The synagogue bells fell silent. The doors of the Juderia were sealed. Entire families disappeared overnight, their homes claimed by neighbours who had once shared their bread. Each tragedy was followed by a fragile return, new families settling among the ruins of the old, lighting new lamps in streets that still smelled of smoke. Spain, ever mercurial, remembered its debts only when convenient. Even in persecution, the communities endured through memory. Stories were told at tables and in whispers, teaching children how to be cautious and proud at the same time. Faith became portable, carried in prayers, recipes, and songs. The Hebrew words of blessings survived even when names were changed to blend in. Some who converted publicly continued to observe privately, lighting Sabbath candles behind shuttered windows, tracing invisible letters in the air. History called them conversos, or crypto-Jews, but in their hearts they called themselves what they had always been. The irony of Jewish life in medieval Spain was that their brilliance was inseparable from their vulnerability. The very skills that made them valuable, literacy, trade, diplomacy, made them suspect. They lived at the intersection of every kingdom's ambition and every faith's anxiety. Yet in their streets and synagogues, they built something that no decree could erase, a culture rooted in memory and reason, faith and intellect, laughter and survival. South of the frontier, where the air turned warm and citrus trees perfumed the wind, the world of Al-Andalus shimmered like a mirage that somehow managed to last for centuries. Here, under domes of ivory stone and skies bright enough to hurt the eyes, civilization took on a softer rhythm. In Cordoba, Granada, and Seville, the great cities of Muslim Spain, life was arranged not around fear or famine, but around the deliberate pursuit of beauty. Gardens murmured with fountains, courtyards bloomed with orange blossoms, and sunlight filtered through latticework, so finely carved it seemed woven from air. For a brief span of history, Spain's southern kingdoms were the envy of the world, a meeting place of poets and physicians, architects and astronomers, where knowledge was as prized as conquest. Cordoba, the jewel of the caliphate, dazzled every traveller who wrote of it. By the 10th century, its population rivaled or surpassed that of any city in Europe. The streets were paved and lit by thousands of lamps, an extravagance that made northern visitors suspect witchcraft. Water flowed through aqueducts into homes, gardens, and public baths. The souk, the marketplace, was a maze of stalls where one could buy silk from Damascus, ivory from Africa, or a book copied just that morning in the caliph's library. That library, said to contain hundreds of thousands of volumes, drew scholars from as far as Persia and Paris. Within its walls, debates on philosophy, mathematics, and medicine unfolded with the same seriousness as wars elsewhere. The city's skyline was a forest of domes and minarets, the call to prayer rising like music at dawn and dusk. Civilization is often measured by cleanliness. Al-Andalus was centuries ahead and despised for it. Granada, later the final stronghold of Muslim Spain, offered its own vision of refinement. Its Kasabah, the citadel, crowned the hills in a geometry of stone and light. The Alhambra, gleaming above the valley, like something imagined rather than built. Within its walls, water sang through channels carved into marble floors, cooling courtyards filled with jasmine and carved inscriptions that proclaimed, "There is no victor but God." The architecture seemed less constructed than grown, arches flowing into one another like verses in a poem, every wall etched with calligraphy so intricate it blurred the line between text and decoration. The palaces of Granada were both fortress and dream, proof that power could be expressed through restraint. Seville, closer to the sea, thrived as the beating heart of trade. Ships carried spices, sugar, and fabrics along the Guadalquivir River, their sails flashing white against the sun. The city's souks were alive with colour and contradiction. Leather workers hammering beside perfumers, spice merchants arguing beside money changers, jugglers and poets competing for attention. The imams called the faithful to prayer from slender towers that would later become church bell towers, proof that beauty endures long after ideology has changed its script. Even the air of Seville carried memory, a blend of salt, musk and baked clay, the perfume of a civilization at ease with itself. Daily life in Al-Andalus was ordered, but rarely dull. Scholars gathered in courtyards shaded by fig trees, debating astronomy or theology with the same intensity their northern neighbours reserved for warfare. Mathematicians traced geometric patterns into sand. Poets recited verses over cups of mint tea, and doctors wrote treatises on diseases still centuries from being rediscovered in Latin. Women, though largely confined to the domestic sphere, managed households that were small empires of efficiency, supervising servants, educating children, and tending to gardens where roses and mint grew side by side. From behind wooden lattices, they watched the world without being seen. Their presence felt in the order of things, if not in the chronicles. Artisans filled the souks and workshops with a symphony of craftsmanship. Potters glazed their tiles in blues and greens that mirrored the sea and sky, creating mosaics so precise they seemed woven from glass. Weavers dyed silk in vats of indigo and saffron until the cloth glowed like sunlight trapped in fabric. Metalworkers etched verses of the Quran onto brass and silver, their tools striking rhythmically through the day. Even the simplest object, a cup, a door hinge, a lamp, was treated as an opportunity for elegance. To make something well was considered a form of prayer. The line between utility and beauty blurred until they became the same thing. Faith structured this world without suffocating it. The 5 daily prayers measured time more gently than bells or taxes. Mosques were built as oases of calm, where worshippers washed their hands and faces before kneeling on cool stone. In cities like Córdoba, Friday prayers could draw thousands, the imam's voice echoing beneath rows of red and white arches that rippled like music frozen in stone. Religion here was less a wall than a foundation. Its certainty allowed art and science to flourish without fear, at least for a while. Education was widespread, a rarity in an age when most of Europe still measured literacy by miracle. Boys and some girls learned to read early, reciting poetry and scripture until the sounds themselves became a kind of music. The caliphs and their viziers patronized scholars lavishly, funding observatories, hospitals, and schools. Medicine advanced with startling sophistication. Andalusian doctors performed surgeries, set bones, and prescribed diets that would not be out of place in modern clinics. Astronomers charted the heavens from observatories in Toledo and Seville, calculating planetary motion with instruments of brass that glimmered like jewellery. Knowledge was not only respected, it was fashionable. The refinement of Al-Andalus was visible even in its sounds. Lutes and tambourines accompanied songs of love, exile, and faith. Poets compared lovers' eyes to stars and rulers' tempers, to storms. Music drifted from courtyards into alleys, from alleys into memory. Every emotion, joy, sorrow, longing, found its echo in verse. To live in this world was to inhabit a poem that never quite ended. Yet beneath the melody lay the faint, persistent rhythm of unease. Prosperity had made Al-Andalus dazzling, but also fragile. The decline began not with invasion, but with division. After centuries of unity under the caliphate, the great cities splintered into smaller taifas, petty kingdoms ruled by ambitious men with more pride than foresight. Alliances shifted like dunes, brothers fought brothers, scholars fled, and generals plotted. The Christian kingdoms to the north, once fragmented, grew organised and hungry. One by one, the cities of Al-Andalus fell: Córdoba, Seville, Valencia, until only Granada remained, a final ember of splendour in a continent grown cold to it. Even in decline, the legacy of Muslim Spain glowed. The architecture of its mosques would become the backbone of Europe's cathedrals, its medicine, the foundation of modern science, its poetry, the ghost beneath the later languages. Yet its fate was sealed by the same irony that defined all empires. It had taught the world too well. The knowledge it shared would one day fuel the powers that destroyed it. By the late 15th century, the courtyards of Granada stood quieter, their fountains whispering to empty air. The call to prayer still rose from the Kasaba, but fewer answered. What had once been a chorus of civilizations became a single fading voice. Still, in the glint of tile, the arch of a doorway, and the shimmer of water under sunlight, one could feel the trace of what had been. A place where beauty was treated as truth, and truth as beauty. As the last towers of Granada dimmed against the setting sun, Spain entered a new age, though for most it looked very much like the old one. The banners had changed, the prayers had changed, and the kings had changed, but life beneath them hardly noticed. The peasants still ploughed the soil, the merchants still haggled, and the monks still rang their bells. History, for all its noise, rarely altered the quiet machinery of survival. Beneath the shifting creeds and crowns, the same sun rose, the same dust rose with it, and the same hands worked to keep both at bay. If one could look down from a hilltop, from the ruins of a fortress or the tower of a cathedral, the view across centuries would blur together. Peasants guided their oxen across the same fields their ancestors had cleared. Artisans bent over the same benches, their tools worn smooth by generations. Monks in their cloisters still whispered the same Latin prayers, barely noticing that the kings they prayed for had been replaced 10 times over. Even the nobles who believed themselves immortal through marble and memory lived variations of the same play. Hunting, feasting, fearing rebellion, and building castles that outlasted neither their wealth nor their names. Spain, for all its change, remained a tapestry woven from repetition. The merchants' coins glittered differently, stamped with new emblems, but they still brought the same illusions of permanence. The soldiers fought new wars under old slogans, their glory measured in mud. The scholars wrote in Latin or Arabic or Castilian, rediscovering questions that had already been asked 100 ways. And still the peasants kept the world turning, their labour as constant and uncelebrated as the sunrise. Civilization, it seemed, was a miracle performed daily by people who would never be remembered for it. The illusion of progress was comforting, but it was illusion all the same. Every ruler imagined his reign eternal. Every faith believed itself final. Every age declared itself wiser. Time disagreed. It folded kingdoms and empires into the same dust, leaving behind only habits. The way bread is broken, the way bells mark the hour, the way people look toward the sky when they have no answers left. In the end, everyone believed they were building eternity. They were mostly building Tuesday, and yet there is a kind of beauty in that repetition. The ordinary endured when the magnificent failed. The prayers of the poor outlived the cathedrals, and the work of nameless hands built the comfort of centuries. Spain, with all its divisions and glories, proved one simple truth. History is not the story of empires, but of persistence. The bells still ring, the dust still rises, and the human need to belong, to make something that lasts, even for a moment, still echoes through the same warm air beneath the same ancient sun. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another forgotten corner of history you'd like explored next. If you'd like early access to more of these quiet descents into forgotten history, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers, Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.